Problems of Translation is a comic adventure full of twists and turns. Charles Abel Baker, a mostly unknown writer of advanced middle age, is seized by the desire to see one of his short stories translated successively into 10 different languages, then back into English, just to see whether it bears any resemblance to what he wrote originally. Sort of a version of the old party game, Telephone. Unsuccessful at getting a publisher to back his gambit, he decides to accomplish his goal himself and accompany his story around the world. Charles has many perilous and at times amusing escapades on this journey, including in the next to the last reading I gave here, being kidnapped by a drug cartel in Mexico. Who knew literary translation could get so perilous? So what's going to happen to poor Charlie now? Well, you're going to get some idea of that. Throughout this journey of Charlie's, unbeknownst to him, 3 retired CIA operatives have been tracking him, working at cross purposes. On the one hand, to scuttle his project, on the other hand, to keep tabs on him and somehow neutralize our naive hero's propensity for getting himself into trouble. Now, with Charlie dangerously disappeared in Mexico, the 3 ex-spooks, codenames Pig, Smilin' Jack, and Mandrake, and by the way, there's going to be a quiz on this after you have to know not only their code names, but also their full names. And I have paper and pencil at the bar that you'll pick up later. So these guys, Pig, Smilin' Jack, and Mandrake, have been summoned to an important meeting, which will probably have something to do with Charlie's fate. Which brings me to this excerpt from chapter 55, which is called Colloquy at Marburg. At 10:30 on a crystal clear September morning, Morton Cruikshank, known to a select few as Pig, sat on a bar stool in the Tokyo airport sipping a Tazawako Jibiru and crunching a mouthful of beer nuts. Beside him on the floor, secured safely behind the bar rail, was a medium-sized beige suitcase with a collapsible handle. Only suits, ties, hankies, and underwear inside, no contraband. He took a slug of beer, rolled it around inside his mouth before swallowing. He sighed. Now this was beer. He sniffed at the glass and took another swallow. Christ, he hated to leave Japan. One of his favorite countries. He not only loved the beer, he was crazy about the women. He glanced at his watch. He wasn't looking forward to this, had almost decided to bag it, but finally agreed, proving he was an all-around nice guy, right? Despite what anybody said. Down deep, he hadn't done anything he wasn't asked to do. Too bad he wouldn't have time to stop off in Frisco. He knew a wonderful bordello there. And that supple brunette, what was her name? Toffee, right. How likely is that? Real name probably Dolores, and she hailed from Dubuque. But she was something. No matter what her name was, eager and enthusiastic, with ding-dong tits. Almost a keeper, that girl. Claimed she'd been a dancer and certainly was flexible. He sighed again, once more consulted his Rolex. Bartender, he called out, hit me one more time, will you? The subtle, faint ting, ting, ting of Roger Wawrinka's alarm sounded, and he sat up in bed in Bern immediately, as if he had never been asleep. He switched off the alarm with a practiced twist and climbed out of bed. He drew on his pants, neatly laid out on a nearby armchair. He strode to his closet. and after a moment's study, selected a pink herringbone shirt with a Windsor collar and a black tie with discreet pink diagonals. Despite the fact that he lived in Bern, Wawrinka, known to a few as Smilin' Jack, traveled widely and bought his shirts on Savile Row. Having knotted his tie before the full-length mirror in the bedroom, he slipped on his handmade all-weather walkers, Orbis, and tied the laces firmly. 15 minutes later, he was in his kitchen, eating toast and jelly. A banana and a chocolate chip muffin stood in readiness beside the small plate. It was enough, he figured. He would have another breakfast on the plane. In first class, he could get almost anything he wanted, and Wawrinka did like to eat. After rinsing his plate and fitting it into the drainer, drying his hands on the soft white Anacini Lorenzo hand towel affixed to his refrigerator with a magnet, he twist-tied his small bag of garbage, glanced at his Breguet Classique, and reached for the handle of his luggage, parked, as it ever was, beside his breakfast chair. The flight would take 7 hours, 51 minutes. He had made it many times before. Fortunately, the luncheon crowds had cleared out of Roberto's, and the fellow whom Eduardo had asked to work the dinner shift this evening, a young actor, had arrived in plenty of time to do setup. Smiling at Antonio, one of the water boys, Eduardo went back to the cloakroom and retrieved his briefcase and laptop. He opened the case, leafed through its contents, snapped it shut, and stood a moment, thinking. He'd been in some unholy snarls in his life. Awful, life-threatening. Like Libya, for example, spying on Gaddafi, needing to know the exact breakdown of his armed forces. Or like what he'd done in Chile. God, he'd hated that. But it was what one did. Most missions he'd been in charge of had been successful to one degree or another, but that didn't mean he was proud. But this, nothing had ever felt so personal. There was a mirror in the cloakroom, a small, round shaving mirror, propped up against the back wall on the lowest shelf. In the dim light of the overhead 40-watt bulb, Eduardo studied his features. He still had his Montalban good looks, he thought, though his full wavy hair had prominent streaks of gray around the ears now. Much of that, it seemed to him, had accumulated in the last few months. The name Mandrake suddenly popped into his mind, his code name, all the time he'd been in service. Mandrake the magician. Well, some kind of magic was needed now, or a whole lot of luck. The actor Bartleby stepped behind the curtain into the closet a moment, having completed his preparations for the dinner rush. You all right, Eddie? Eduardo glanced at the clock. I'm fine, Bart. Have a good evening. He smiled, slipped the laptop in his case, and walked across the empty restaurant, carrying his 2 bags.